I'm very honored to be here, and I'm very impressed with much of what I've seen at the University of Maastricht. This is the outline for what I'm going to talk about today. My first topic is that grandmother really did know best about some things. The second is counterintuitive insights from neuroscience and psychology. The third has to do with brain plasticity. And the last has to do with the importance of action for learning. Before I begin, my specialty is prefrontal cortex and the executive functions that depend on that. So I just wanted to orient you a little bit to what I'll be emphasizing in my talk. This is where the eyes are. So this is the front of the brain, and this is the back. The central sulcus divides the front from the back. All of the cortex in front of the central sulcus, this massive area, is frontal cortex. It's a huge part of the human brain. The area outlined in red is prefrontal cortex. That's the area of the brain that I specialize in. The functions of prefrontal cortex are often summarized as executive functions. And there are really three core executive functions. Executive functions are what you need when you can't go on automatic, when either it would be insufficient or it would lead you astray, when you need top-down control, when you have to plan, when you have to problem solve, when you're faced with a new situation. One of the core executive functions is inhibition, or self-control, being able to resist the strong inclination to do one thing and instead do what's correct or expected. So, for example, it might be staying on task when you're now become bored with what you were doing, or when other people are doing something that seems much more fun. Paying attention despite distraction, as if in a cocktail party. Or resisting a luscious dessert when you'd like to lose weight. All of that requires inhibition, self-discipline. Another aspect of executive function is working memory, holding information in mind and working with it. For example, relating one idea to another or doing mental arithmetic. Working memory makes it possible to consider things from different perspectives, to compare one idea to another. It also makes it possible to remember what your plans were or what someone asked you to do. Finally, the third component is cognitive flexibility, being able to flexibly switch perspectives or the focus of attention, being able to think outside the box. And of course, in a rapidly changing world, that's absolutely critical. Okay, so to the first topic, that grandmother really did know best. A great deal of cultural wisdom, I think, built up over hundreds of years, is being ignored and lost. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Childhood, ages 4, 5, 6 years of age, used to be a time of play. Now preschool teachers and kindergarten teachers feel under more and more pressure not to let the children play, but to have them sit and take instruction. They're afraid that if the children will play, it takes away from their time of instruction and for how well the children will do. And in fact, that's wrong. Not only do children need to play for many reasons, but in the course of playing, they develop the very executive functions that they need to do well in school and in life. If you're doing social play with other children, you have to hold in mind what role you're playing and what role your friends are playing. You have to keep that information in mind. You have to inhibit behaviors that are inconsistent with your role. If you've adopted the role of the baby in the family, you can't all of a sudden stand up and tell everybody what to do. You have to stay within the constraints of the role. It trains children in executive functions. It performs a very important educational role that is often being lost these days in the push to have preschool like college. Another thing your grandmother probably told you is you need to get your sleep. There's a recent explosion in the diagnoses of ADHD. The number of children taking medication for ADHD, just between the years, the 5-year range of 1995 to 1999, increased 400% in the U.S. About 25% of the children diagnosed with ADHD have sleep apnea or other problems in sleeping. Lack of sleep will produce deficits in executive function skills, and cause someone to look as if he or she has ADHD. This can be corrected by aiding the person to get a good night's sleep. There's several publications on this, and this is an older one. This is from 2001. There are now many more and many more with children. Here it says, obstructive sleep apnea, OSA, is a common disorder. Because of the overlap of symptoms, patients with OSA may be considered to have ADHD. Significant improvement in symptoms has been reported with the use of continuous positive airway pressure in patients with OSA. We present reports here of adults who were being treated for ADHD and were in fact found to have OSA. Here you don't need medication. You just need help in being able to sleep properly. 25% of the children who are now on medication for ADHD probably don't need to be on that medication. Also, circadian rhythms, sleep patterns, change around puberty. It's normal for adolescents to want to wake up later. Now, problems arise if they're allowed to get up and stay up later on the weekends, because that makes it extremely difficult for them to fight their biological preference and get up early for school on Monday morning. Okay, that's something people don't think about. People think, on the weekend you can just relax, but you reset your biological clock, and that can make it very hard when you start the work week again. Okay, counterintuitive insights from neuroscience and psychology. This is a very early fMRI study that we did. It looked at a task that required executive function, and so you get activation of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is what is shown here. Now, some people show activation on both sides of the brain, both sides of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Some people show activation primarily on one side, and some people show activation primarily on the other side. 2 of our subjects didn't show activation in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex at all. This is Ruth Brigida. This is Kathy O'Craven, collaborators on our study. The reason they didn't show activation is you only see prefrontal activation when a task is new and challenging. Once you're familiar with the task, prefrontal activation usually drops out. So, of course, our collaborators were familiar with our task and weakened our effect. You want to be able to use prefrontal cortex whenever you're presented with the unexpected, when you need to think outside the box, when you need to adapt to change, when you need to concentrate particularly hard. But what you want for most tasks is that they become so familiar and well learned that prefrontal cortex is no longer needed. Instead, those tasks are handed off to the subcortical regions of the brain that have had thousands of more years of evolutionary time to perfect their functioning and can subserve task performance ever so much more efficiently than prefrontal cortex. People think it's great to have prefrontal cortex involved. Well, that's true at the beginning, but then it's not great to have prefrontal cortex involved. Think of the things that you know how to do extremely well. Think of bike riding, for example, or any skill that you're very good at. If you think about it, you mess it up. You don't do it as well. You want prefrontal cortex out of the way and let the other areas of the brain subserve it more efficiently and more elegantly. How do you get prefrontal cortex out of the brain and it handed over to the other regions of the brain? Practice, practice, practice. You have to train the brain up. You're basically training a neural system, just like you would a computer system. So it hands it off to the older areas of the brain. You don't have to think about it anymore. And here's an example where the new technology, where computer games can be particularly helpful. Because children love computer games. If you have a good computer game, they will play it for hours. And if you have a good computer game that trains a cognitive skill that you want somebody to improve on, go for it. Because that's exactly the way to get the brain trained up and for the right areas of the brain to be exercising that function. This is another example of a counterintuitive insight from neuroscience. You can easily bias the situation to favor the performance of males or females. For example, the head of one graduate program at Harvard University told incoming students to look to their right, look to their left. 1 out of every 3 people would likely not make it past the first year of the program. Putting students on edge in that way would favor the performance of male students. Males perform better if slightly stressed, but females perform worse under stress, even if only slight stress. So, for example, this is an example from an animal study. Here's performance under no stress, here's performance under slight stress. The males perform better under slight stress, but females perform worse, even under very slight stress. The head of my graduate program at Harvard University gave us a very different message. What he said is, you may think you were the accident, that you got into this program by some fluke and we didn't mean it. He said, I want to assure you we know what we're doing. And we know what we were doing when we accepted you, and we expect you fully to graduate from this program and to go on to illustrious careers, every one of you. A very different message. This is just a reminder that the overlap between any variable about males and females is that men and women are more similar in cognitive ways than different. So if I say that women tend to perform worse under stress and males better under slight stress, I'm talking only about the extremes of the distribution. In most ways, you see the same results for men and women. Okay, topic 3. The brain is remarkably plastic, far more so than previously believed. Exercise, use, practice can improve the functioning of a neural system, cognition, just as it improves muscle functioning, motor skills. Early bilingualism, by continuously challenging inhibition and cognitive flexibility, is an experience that accelerates the rapid development of executive functions and the neural systems subserving them. Similarly, remaining actively bilingual preserves higher cognitive functioning longer into old age. There's a lot of evidence that if you're fluently bilingual, you have to inhibit one language when you use the other. You may know the perfect word in one language, but your listener doesn't understand that language. You have to inhibit that word and try to come up with a substitute in the other language. If you're speaking to partners who speak only one of several different languages, you have to switch between the different languages when you're talking. It demands a lot of cognitive flexibility and inhibition. And if you're constantly switching back and forth, you're constantly exercising the prefrontal system, the executive function system, and it makes that system mature earlier. Ellen Bialystok has shown in a large series of studies that little kids, 4 or 5 years of age, who are fluently bilingual, are a year or two, an enormous proportion of their life, 1 or 2 years of a child only 4 or 5 years of age, ahead of other children who are only monolingual. They're not ahead on memory, they're not ahead on IQ, they're not ahead on vocabulary. Typically, they're behind in vocabulary because they're learning 2 vocabularies, but they're consistently ahead on executive functions. So, for example, here's one task where you're supposed to say which tower has more blocks. So this is easy because the taller tower has more blocks. But this is harder because the perceptual pull is to say this tower, the taller one, but in fact the shorter tower has more blocks. So that requires executive function, and children who are bilingual outperform monolingual peers. In a card sorting task, where you have to switch between sorting by shape or sorting by color, bilingual children are a year ahead of their monolingual peers. Similarly, on this other task, regardless of what bilingual group you look at, the bilinguals are ahead on executive function compared to monolinguals. I said earlier today that this is an example of where Europeans are way ahead of Americans. I'm American, and I speculated that maybe the U.S. government might have functioned better if our leaders had early learned a second language. I also want to mention an outstanding preschool program called Tools of the Mind. It's based on the theories of Luria and Vygotsky and was developed by Ilana Batrova and Deborah Leong. Tools of the Mind is an evidence-based program grounded in the idea that training executive functions is as important as teaching reading and math, and that executive function skills are learned best by embedding training in them in all aspects of the school day. Liang and Bott-Rover found that when executive function activities were a special add-on, were a module, the children improved on the activities they practiced in the module, but it didn't generalize. In order for it to generalize, scaffolding of executive function and challenging of executive function had to be part and parcel of all the activities that they did in school all day long. An example of a tools of the mind activity is buddy reading. They tell each of the children to get into a pair with another child, and each child is to get a picture book and prepare to tell the other child a story that goes with the pictures. So if you have 2 3-year-olds or 2 4-year-olds, each ready to tell their story, nobody wants to listen. Everybody wants to tell their story. So what they do in Tools of the Mind is they give one child a picture of lips and another child a picture of an ear. And they explain that ears don't talk, ears listen. And with that concrete symbol to refer back to, the child listens. And after a few months, they don't need the pictures anymore. The children have internalized it. As I mentioned this morning, many faculty members have requested these cards for their faculty meetings. Also, play, social make-believe play, is a big part of the Tools of the Mind program. It was something that Vygotsky emphasized as critically important for the development of executive functions. We compared Tools of the Mind to another new program that was instituted at the same time with the same materials, same support to the teachers, same curricular content, and the teachers were randomly assigned to Tools of the Mind or the other program. The conditions differed only in that Tools of the Mind included executive function promoting activities interwoven in all school activities throughout the day. The children came from the same neighborhoods and were randomly assigned to Tools of the other program. And they were very similar in all kinds of characteristics, in age and ethnicity. They were all fairly poor, similar in mother's education, etc. We gave them an executive function task, which I won't go into in detail, but if the dots were gray, you had to press on the same side as the dot, and if the dots were striped, you had to press on the opposite side. So you had to remember 2 rules, and in these trials, you had to inhibit your natural tendency to press on the same side as the stimulus. So first they got only congruent trials, which doesn't require executive function. Then they got only incongruent trials, where they always had to inhibit pressing on the same side. And then they got these intermixed, which is the hardest condition. If you look at performance in the incongruent condition, what you find is a linear relationship with the number of years of tools the child had. This is significant, but it's not a big difference. It's statistically significant, but it doesn't amount to anything particularly tangible that you can observe. But now if you look at the harder mixed condition, there were too few children in the other curriculum who passed practice to be able to compare performance in the mixed condition. Twice as many children in tools passed practice for the mixed condition than in no tools. This is not only statistically significant, this is realistically significant. This is a big difference. Whether children were in Tools of the Mind or not accounted for more variance in their executive functioning than their age or their gender. The more executive functioning, the more demanding of executive functioning the task, the more highly the task correlated with academic performance. I should also mention that these children show huge advances in academic performance, in study after study, in state after state in the United States. These are very disadvantaged children, children seriously at risk. Usually when they take standardized tests, either state tests or national tests, in preschool or kindergarten, they perform way behind other children. Tools of the Mind children, even though they're coming from very disadvantaged backgrounds and are in a classroom with all other disadvantaged children, perform up to the state and local standards. They perform they perform completely at the state standard and the national standard, which is a major achievement. Special enrichment or after-school activities may not be the best way to improve executive functions. Similarly with bilingualism, if children take a second language as a course in school, you do not see the advantages of bilingualism. The child has to be fluently bilingual, has to be excellent in both languages, and has to exercise this all day long, rather than simply getting the second language as a module in one little subject during the school day. You need to task executive function continually throughout the day to see a real difference. Many studies have found that executive function makes a unique contribution to academic outcomes in both language skills and especially mathematics, independent of and more strongly than general intelligence, IQ. Clancy Blair concluded from his own study, it's often thought that kids don't do well because they're dumb, and there's nothing we can do about it. But not only is executive function pivotal for academic success, it's amenable to training. Self-discipline, exercising the self-control to inhibit temptations, predicts academic performance more robustly than IQ. Martin Seligman concluded, discipline influences achievement more than talent does. You'll forget many of the facts you learned in school, but hopefully you'll retain the skills. Skills such as cognitive flexibility, attentional control, and discipline. These will be far more important to your success than memorized facts. You can always look up a fact. Also critically important are other components, such as attitude. And I'd like to share with you this quote from Charles Swindoll. The longer I live, the more I realize the impact of attitude on life. Attitude is more important than facts, more important than money, than circumstances, than failures or success, than what other people think or say or do. It's more important than appearances, giftedness, or skill. The remarkable thing is, you have a choice every day regarding the attitude you will embrace for that day. We can't change our past. We can't change the fact that people will act in a certain way. We can't change the inevitable. The only thing we can do is play the one string we have, and that's our attitude. I'm convinced that life is 10% what happens to me and 90% how I react to it. Another aspect of attitude is not to be afraid to be wrong or to make mistakes, not to be afraid to raise your hand and say, I don't understand. The only way to ever avoid being wrong is to stay with what you already know. But the only way to grow and the only way to push the envelope of what is known is to venture into the unknown. Albert Einstein said, anyone who's never made a mistake has never tried anything new. Samuel Proctor Macy was the grandson of slaves and rose to be one of the most famous chemists of the 20th century. He's ranked together with Marie Curie, James Watson, and Francis Crick. He said, you've never failed until you've tried for the last time, and you've never lost until you quit. I think that's a terribly important lesson, not to give up, not to say I failed just because your first or 10th attempt didn't work. Okay, finally, the importance of action for learning. Should Maastricht University invest in great lecturers, people who are dynamic, funny, and thoroughly entertaining? Students learn best not by listening, no matter how wonderful the speaker, but by actively engaging the material themselves. It is here that Maastricht's commitment to problem-based learning is so brilliant. Maastricht students are incredibly lucky to be at a university committed to that approach, committed to challenging students to take an active role in their own learning. I have seen problem-based learning at business schools, but I have never seen it infused throughout a university the way it is at Maastricht. We evolved to be able to learn things because we needed to know them for what we wanted to do. Think of who learns a route better, the driver or a passenger? The driver, of course. Why? Because the driver needs to use the information to guide action. The passenger doesn't. We did not evolve to learn things in the abstract. Schooling is a very recent development in evolutionary history. Requiring students to learn in the abstract is asking them to do something very unnatural. If you can show students why they need to learn something, how it relates to what they want to do, or embedded in an activity they care about, then what seems so hard for some students to grasp will be far easier for them. Again, this is the picture of the brain. This is frontal cortex. And I wanted to point out that prefrontal cortex is part of frontal cortex, but so is motor cortex. Motor cortex is part of frontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is centrally involved in what we do. There's no accident that they're both part of the same frontal lobe of the brain. Each new activity requires different information for its guidance, and so provides the occasion for gaining new information about the world around you. For example, you need different information to use a table, to make a table, or to draw a table. Do different activities. Don't just study. And don't just study one subject. Expose yourself to other disciplines as well, because each new thing you expose yourself to will allow you to see the same thing from different perspectives. It will allow you to gain more knowledge about what you're interested in. Art, music, dance, and sports are not just nice extras for a school curriculum. They're essential for an outstanding education. If used to help teach math, history, or other subjects, they can also make them much more fun. Serious and important subjects do not need to be somber or boring. People work harder and attend school more eagerly if they enjoy it. Cognitive skills and motor skills use highly overlapping brain systems. Training up those brain systems through physical activities enhances their functioning for cognition as well. Also, the more aerobically fit you are, the better the blood flow to the brain, the better the brain functions. This has been shown to be particularly important for prefrontal cortex and executive functions. Children who receive musical training display superior cognitive performance on non-musical academic tests. Children who've received dance training perform better on executive function tests. I'm now going to show you a video produced by the National Dance Institute. I hope that you'll get many lessons from the video, not just that dance and arts are important in the curriculum. One of the things you'll see, I hope, is that many of the things that Maastricht University achieves through problem-based learning are emphasized in this video. For example, challenging students to reach beyond what they thought they could do, to reach as far as they possibly can. Secondly, the importance of students helping each other and working together. Too much of education is individual. You're considered to cheat if you help another student on a test. I had my students at University of British Columbia. I told them that they could study together and should help each other because I wasn't going to grade on a curve. So they didn't need to worry if the other student did well, it wouldn't hurt their grade. And they worked together and they learned together. My university scolded me up and down. They said, you have to do a normal curve, you have to have a normal distribution. The next time you teach, you make sure that you have this distribution. But then the students don't want to study together, because now if one person does well, it will hurt their grade.